I'm here with Laynie Browne.
Hello.
Hi, Laynie.
Hi.
And Gabby, Ojeda-Sagué.
Hey,
Gabby, how are you?
Good. Welcome to
We're
Chicago.
visiting your city.
It's true.
Do you think of it as your city by now?
I think so.
Okay, good.
I pay rent, so, you know.
And you pay taxes, I
Yes,
think,
I
of
do.
some kind.
Yes, I do.
Well, we're going to talk about Carl Sandburg's Chicago. It's an emblematic poem of his career. It was part of Chicago Poems 1916. This is the most famous of the poems. Sandburg performed all his life. He lived a long time. I mean, really, the last poems he wrote of any significance were in the 1930s. He lived through the 60s. So he's sort of Faustian in his legendary status. So this is the most famous poem. And we decided to film here on location, not just being in Chicago, but more specifically, Laynie, tell us where we are. What is behind us?
We are at the entrance to the Union Stockyard Gate, which is the only thing that remains of what was the largest meat packing complex in the world. So the animals here were brought in and they were slaughtered and then they were, cut up into all the parts and packaged.
So Chicago is this, still is, but certainly was then, centrally located producer. And so you had freight coming in to deliver the hogs from farms, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, etc., and also locally.
Right.
And then, of course, freight going back out to suppliers or providers of meat. So Chicago's centrality was a point of pride. It was also a reason for so much immigration.
Right.
And lives for working class.
50,000 immigrants worked here.
First, people from Poland, Germany, Bohemia.
Did we say Ireland? Yes.
Ireland.
Yes.
And then later.
African Americans, Mexican Americans.
Basically until, we're looking out on what was once a vast, I don't know, I want to say
it was a square mile of
stockyards.
Buildings. Yeah.
And how many hogs were slaughtered?
Over 1 million.
Over 1 million. So that's what we're talking about. And Sandburg unapologetically, sentimentally, romantically celebrates the brawniness and industrialness, the industry of Chicago, and of course of the working class people who were caught in this machinery. And so we have to grapple with this poem, which was romanticizing that. Before we do that, let's talk about it to some extent as in line of Whitmanian poems, because I think we should start there. And the big question for us in ModPo is, does this go in week 2 as a Whitmanian poem, or does it go into week 5 along with the proletarian poems and the leftist poems? Because his book, The People Yes, which was published in 1936, was embraced by the United Front. He was by no means a communist, but he was embraced by the communists and other union organizers. So, one of the things I'm going to ask the two of you now to talk about is, does this Whitmanism become a proletarianism that makes any sense with respect to the 30s, even though this is a 1914 poem? Gabby, you first. Go anywhere with any of that.
I think that the Whitman style is already kind of proletarianized. Whitman was all about the kind of shipyard workers and the different kinds of industries of his time, and his poems really take on the same sort of list form that this poem is interested in,
and the long lines,
and the same kind of eroticization of that masculine industry thing. So it does feel Whitman, even though it's kind of tracing a through line into what becomes the sort of organized labor of the early 20th century.
Can I ask you a follow-up, and then we'll turn to Laynie? Because we're going to get to the Whitmanian strain of loving the brawny men who do this work. But let me try this on for size, and you tell me if it's wrong-headed. So Whitman was not interested in industry for its sake, not interested in what a city like Chicago would be doing, more interested in the men and the people, but mostly the men who did the work, and what they looked like and what it felt to be with them. And he had a longing to be one of them.
Yeah.
Sandburg, as far as I know, not interested in that
Right.
as a biographical matter. But he turns that longing into something else. It becomes an industrial or commercial thing. capitalism produces masculinity, but he's not interested, so that any of the homosociality and, in fact, homosexuality in the imagery gets suppressed a couple layers down, I guess. Does that sound right to you?
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think Whitman is interested in plurality. I mean, he wants, like, the reason he's talking about industry is to kind of recoup that social masculine sphere and to feel like he's going between high and low and kind of elevating all these sort of ordinary things. In that sense, I think the Sandburg is still kind of like that, in that it's trying to elevate a kind of lower cultural thing, kind of a working cultural sphere. But I think Whitman's is so much obviously about kind of the being with and that togetherness, that social togetherness that's totally eroticized. Here it's more about a kind of like a strength in spite of a certain kind of difficulty to the city, I think.
We're definitely going to come back to that. Laynie, what are your thoughts about Whitman and the Whitmanian line here?
So I agree with Gabby. I think this could easily go early with Whitman, but it could also go into week 5 in terms of thinking about the lives of all the workers. I mean, not to mention the animals that were being slaughtered, but the work that the immigrants did in this meat packing place was dangerous and grueling and not great.
So among the celebratory language here, you're saying there's also this sense that the people, that the men, are in a way caught in a machinery themselves. So I guess I would ask both of you, or maybe all three of us, need to look at the text and find a place where the celebration gives way to some empathy or concern about the lives of these people. Can we find such stuff? Because it's easy to find the celebration. The terrible burden of destiny, is that the slaughter? The working conditions, under the smoke, dust all over his mouth, laughing with white teeth, laughing out of the pride of his city.
Yeah.
It's a horrible, almost minstrel, it's almost a blackface. That's very suppressed, but this idea of a dusky person, which is being celebrated in unintentionally and intentionally racist poems of this time, with the white teeth, so the smile is emerging from this hard-working, dirty person.
Yeah.
I don't know, your turn.
Well, I think also there's the line on the faces of women and children, I've seen the marks of wanton hunger, makes me think about, like, this is a kind of like center for feeding the world. This is like a place where food is going to be centrally moving to everybody. And maybe for one of the first times in this nation's history, en masse, in a way that hadn't happened before. I mean, before this, the butcher who would sell the meat was also the person who slaughtered the animal, and that's something that's changing at this moment in industrialization.
The industrialization of food production for a big, bustling country.
But so to have that mixed with there being so much hunger in the city, at the same time as one is like the feeder of the nation, there's a serious like distribution problem or something that I think is being exposed here.
Right. There's a huge paradox there, right? And celebrating the dehumanization of the people and their hard work, but also celebrating, I feel like, the sense of there's brutality happening in the industry here, but there's a coarseness, there's a hardness, there's a broad-shoulderedness of the people to endure, which is, of course, complicated and problematic, but I feel like he's trying to say, but the people are tough and they're doing it anyway, and look at how hard they're working.
Right. Okay, so I've already put a pin in the latent homosociality, and now we're putting a pin in this whole question of the aggression, which becomes a horrible metaphor. So put a pin in both those things. Now let's just go back to the Whitmanian thing. So Wordsworth and so forth, tired of cities, longingly went to the rustic, meaning the rustic person, peasant, and romanticize, that's a funny word to use, talking about Wordsworth, romanticize that rustic in a rural setting. This was still a person who was, wielding a pitchfork and moving hay and gathering. Now, Sandburg is called the first American urban folk singer. Whitman takes that romantic rustic and puts that person in the city. And this is continuing that. So he's got a lot of arguing to do about the reputation of the rustic, as it were, in the city. They tell me you're wicked, they tell me you're crooked, they tell me you're brutal, and the answer is, hell yeah, I guess, right?
Right, yeah.
Can you both comment
Yeah.
on this? It's a very interesting move, and it is why, my last question, which I have in my mind, the last question at the end of this, is going to be about why the hell Harriet Monroe would publish this poem in Poetry Magazine along with H.D. and Pound and Richard Aldington and, Amy Lowell and the Imagists and all that. What the hell is this? Hold on to that, but I think there's something to be said about the citification, the urbanization of the Whitmanian, or the continuation in the 20th century at the time of modernism of the Whitmanian celebration. So again, the question is, what do you want to say about this argument he has to make with a poetic tradition that goes back to Wordsworth?
I feel like he's saying if I sing loud enough, I'll
Convince
it
you?
will be true. Come and show me another city with lifted heads, singing so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning.
It's telling you to sing.
Yeah.
To this day,
It's like an
young
advertisement for the city.
who are asked to celebrate the city
Yeah.
will sing this, will recite this song without any irony. Gabe, your thoughts? Gabby, your thoughts on this?
I think I almost feel like this this poem wants to go slightly back almost to maybe almost like a neoclassical reverence for the kind of soldier's joy, the soldier's sociality. We get to this point where laughing even as an ignorant fighter laughs who has never lost a battle, bragging and laughing that under his wrist is the pulse and under his ribs the heart of the people. So it's almost like to get out of the kind of romantic tradition, metaphysical tradition of the, escape from the city, that anxiety about massing culture. It's almost like going a little bit earlier, I think, in cribbing from a certain epic masculinity to kind of give value to what the city's particular form leads to.
All right, let's turn back to this question of image and metaphor, just diction and vocabulary that makes us think that his longing extended to the male body and that's a thing. I'll start. There's a lot of bareness, bareheaded, husky, half naked, and sweating.
Stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders, of course. Alive and coarse and strong and cunning.
Yeah.
Could it just be innocently adopted from Whitman without thinking?
I think so. I think there is a possibility of that it's, I don't know, it sort of reminds me of like all the different cultural things that we kind of read in double. Like I think of Arnold Schwarzenegger's Pumping Iron, where he's using all this language about his own body that's like so intensely sexualized and it's kind of dizzying, but at the same time, he's like, yeah, we're straight men doing our thing, And so there's always that ability to kind of read it in double. And I think here he is still cribbing from a kind of a language of the worker, the masculine worker, and it rings in a particular way, I think.
So a straight poet in the Whitmanian tradition can look at the village people and say, they're workers.
The village people, yes.
Right.
I did say the village people.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Am I
so.
wrong? Like, you can look at the village people and say, oh, they're workers like me. They're union people, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's macho man in a sense.
Well, let me introduce, Laynie, the way that the sexualization of this, intended or not, becomes an aggression that we should be worried about
Yes.
in 2022. I'll read 2 lines. Flinging magnetic curses amid, whatever they are, magnetic curses. Flinging magnetic curses amid the toil of piling job on job. So that's cool. Here is a tall, bold slugger set vivid against the little soft cities.
Oof.
Okay, and then one more line.
Yeah.
Fierce as a dog, because so animalization is problematic in this poem because it's not
Yeah.
dogs who are being slaughtered, although who knows, hogs. Fierce as a dog with tongue lapping for action. So the bull slugger is drooling over this with a big tongue. Cunning as, unfortunate metaphor alert, simile alert, cunning as a savage pitted against the wilderness. Usually, by the way, it's the colonialist, pith-helmeted guy who's
Pitted against
sexualizing against the wilderness. This is weird and mixed up. The
Yeah.
savage is pitted against the wilderness, but then little soft cities. Ooh, what do you want to do with this?
Wince.
After you wince, because
After I wince,
we're being filmed.
So I
Like
feel
we have to talk about
Yeah,
this.
we have to talk about it. I mean, so one obvious problem is that the city is being set up as a violent bully, and in response to wanting to be the center, if in this industrial way, they're just gonna slug and brutalize and rape and just
Against the soft cities.
the soft cities, meaning any other city that tries to get in the way, they're gonna dominate.
So
and be
here's
violent.
to you, Lower Manhattan or Nob Hill in San Francisco, wherever
Right.
that is. In other words, you, effete,
Right.
urban, jacket and tie wearing types.
Yeah.
Right.
Chicago ain't in for that because we're guys who are hungering
Right.
for aggression, and then that's how we make the hogs.
Right.
And you will eat our pork
As if
chops.
that were a good thing. Violence, you know.
And it's interesting that
Brutalization.
this moment is so mixed in its metaphors. You know,
Yeah.
okay, so it's a kind of hard masculine, but it's also a dog, and also it's a savage, and it's this moment is weird in this poem. I mean, it's almost kind of bad in a sense that it's like.
It's almost like Flarf or something.
Yeah,
so
it's kind
bad.
of throwing a lot at the board to make this construction. It
Right.
feels like I would say, there's almost like a defensiveness, I think. And I think that gesture makes some sense, that there's a way in which this poem is a response to a certain kind of denigration of the status and work of Chicago in this moment, which I guess is still sort of like rebuilding from some of the fire legacies in the late 1800s. But to do that defensiveness, it gets almost mixed up in itself, and this moment stops sort of like actually cohering in some ways.
Yeah. I want to throw something in about eugenics for a second. And then I want to ask that last question about what does this mean that Harriet Monroe chose this to be with the modernists, and whether there is any modernism in this. Eugenics. The little soft cities. So the right-wing, I guess there is no such thing as not right-wing eugenics. No, okay, I'm wrong. But right-wing eugenicists at this period, from the 1880s through around 1920-some, really ended when we entered World War II. So eugenics was all about reversing the problem of the little soft cities. How of men, particularly who went to offices, who didn't work out and became, soft-looking and feminized. So there was a worry about feminization, which is a very familiar thing, of course. But there was also a worry that the immigrants would be the ones who would be strong and broad-shouldered, and that they would produce the next generation. So it's a racist fear.
Yeah.
And the Sandburg is all confused, but he's not confused in this response to the eugenicists. He kind of accidentally takes the side of the eugenicists in characterizing the office workers and the Jewish intellectuals and the NAACP and those people, takes the little soft cities and makes that the thing against which the hog butcher is going to correct. So that's a mistake politically, ideologically, but I do agree with Gabby that this is totally confused.
Yeah.
However, something that needs to be reclaimed is it's an anti-racist or an anti-immigrant or an anti-eugenics claim for producing stuff at this time when it couldn't be done at the corner butcher. It had to be done in an industrialization situation. And that's my thought, and I like this poem as worried about eugenics and immigration in this respect. Okay, so it's published in Poetry magazine in 1914, a key moment as Harriet Monroe and her colleagues turned to experimental poetry produced in London and New York typically, not in Chicago. And she publishes this poem with them. So as an open question, I have no idea what the answer is. I'd love for the two of you, and then we'll do final thoughts, but I'd love for the two of you to offer your last specific thoughts on this by thinking about the possible modernity or even modernism of it. Tough question.
Well, I would start by saying I feel like aesthetically it doesn't make any sense at all. But
So why did Harriet Monroe want it?
A speculation would be that at a moment of wanting to establish Chicago as a literary center,
This is what they had.
it's
Right.
helpful to publish a poet who is so popular.
Yeah, I guess he was
There's
getting
so
to be
many
popular.
people.
He really
And
became popular in
celebrating the city.
1916 with the Chicago poems, but I think
Yeah.
you're right. Yeah.
That's my guess.
So your guess is Monroe was being strategic in accepting this poem for publication.
Yes.
Okay, I love it. Gabby, what are your thoughts?
I think there is some of that in the sense of like creating a kind of brand of Chicago poetics. I mean, I think there's also something here about dealing with the changing technological moment. Where kind of like, if much of modernism is a response to the kind of massification that is going on in social life in the cities, but in somebody like, I don't know, Pound or Stein, that's a much darker and I think somewhat more formally interesting look at those things. Here we still have a lot of the same concerns, I think, about what the kind of like contemporary culture will look like. And this is, I don't know, it's sort of ambivalent in the middle about that. It's taking a little bit from a moment just before itself, in that the stockyards open about 50 years prior to this being published, or 40, but it's also kind of looking towards something about what's changing in the American labor landscape.
I think you're both right. I want to add two thoughts. One is to just follow on what you said, and another is to introduce a totally different thought. Yes, so cities are interesting to modern poets, and what he's writing here could not have, I mean, with the exception of Whitman, could not have been called a poem for most of the previous 2 centuries, including the Romantics. This is not poetic material. And it is also bombastic and rhetorical in a folk song way. I mean, he is thought of as not only prophetic of the in some essays that he was writing about white-black relations in Chicago in the early 1919. He was prophetic in his thinking about the city of the race riots that would occur later in the summer of 1919, and he was embraced by the NAACP, by Joel Spingarn, as someone who had written very brilliantly about the problem of soldiers coming home from World War II back to a city like Chicago and what would happen to race relations. So he's sort of savvy about what he's doing in the poem, and he's making a poem that couldn't be called poetry for a long time into essentially a song. The other thing he's thought of as prophetic of is the first and the second folk revival, the first in the 40s and the second in the early 60s. And I think this is a folk song. And if we think of it that way, what Harriet Monroe is doing, she had an assistant editor, Alice Corbin Henderson, who was really interested in collecting folk materials, particularly in the Southwest, of indigenous people. And somehow, weirdly, Sandburg comes around to the office of Poetry Magazine with this folk song, and they decided this was another interest of modernists, which is this kind of anthropology,
Right.
this sort of primitivism, may I say, that that Picasso went in for a while. I do think we have a Picasso statue here. Let me see if I can find it. No, I don't. I don't think we have a Picasso. But there is a primitivism for sure. Okay, and my last thought is very insider baseball in Poetry Magazine. Harriet Monroe had a problem around 1914, which is the people who were on the board of what was called the Society for Poetry. It's sort of the forerunner of what's now the Poetry Foundation. And these were, pardon me, little old ladies from St. Louis. They were Midwestern poet types, and you should see the stuff that they wanted accepted. I've been to the archives at the University of Chicago to look at this stuff. Sandburg is an interesting sop to them because they're complaining about Pound and HD. And even Hemingway, who I think had a couple poems in Poetry Magazine. Here's a Chicago poet. I think she published this to be able to say to her board, we're supporting Chicago poets. It would have been appalling to them for sure.
Politics.
I think magazine politics. I
Yeah.
think she
Yeah.
had to manage
It's
modernism, and I
always
think
there.
Sandburg got thrown in with it. I love it. All right, quick final thoughts. Laynie, do
Sure.
you have one?
I'm thinking about how this poem is an attempt to celebrate a city and a moment in history, and it's a moment where a lot of things are being dismantled that were once celebrated, and in the now, I mean. So it just makes me think about, well, how do we celebrate cities now and all the complexity and all the problems, and what poets are doing that brilliantly in the moment. Nothing's immediately coming to mind, but I feel like this poem brings up that question because the moment is always fraught in one way or another.
It's very hard to write a poem about a city and have
Yeah.
it survive 80, 90 years
Right.
and still be representative. Gabby, your final thought?
Yeah, I think I'll end with a micro thought that actually I'll need your help with. What's our Whitman Canuck line that we like so
Yes,
much?
Tuckahoe, Senator Tuckahoe, yeah.
Something Canuck. Yeah.
Yes, Canuck.
Okay, that
With a K. Canuck with a K,
Yes,
I think.
I think that's right.
No,
yeah.
with a C, with a C.
That is like the total parallel to bareheaded shoveling, wrecking, planning, building, breaking, rebuilding, and
Yes.
where that Whitman line goes across a lot of kind of space at once. This little list is going through a lot of time really quickly. It's kind of condensing all of this industrial process from just shoveling to building and then rebuilding that thing because Chicago is a city that's been built again over itself several times. And that's like a micro version of that sort of Whitmanian impulse that I think is here.
Oh, I really like that. And that's a modern moment, too, where he just gives you a vertical list. Okay, my final thought builds on that, as it were, builds. Building, breaking, rebuilding. I think what we have here is the potential of a modern meta poem where the breaking and the rebuilding of a city that has to remake itself is the poem, that the poem is broken or it has to be broken. This is not a broken poem, but it kind of edges toward it, especially in that moment. Bareheaded, shoveling, wrecking, planning, building, breaking. This poem is really into the rebuilding, whereas the poems that surround it in a course like Modpo are more about breaking. This poem is more about rebuilding. And that is that person who is in the process of rebuilding. I assume this is a reference to the Great Chicago Fire, under the smoke, dust all over his mouth, laughing like, we rise again, I am the heartbeat of America, So the rebuilding, it makes us a little queasy sometimes because the poem is so rebuilt, but breaking comes just before it, and it's kind of edging toward breaking. Laynie, thank you.
Thank
Gabby,
you.
this has been fun.
Yeah.
Thanks.